Welcome to our deep dive into one of America's oldest mysteries, the Lost Colony of Roanoke. American history is filled with stories of conquest and collapse, victories written in ink, and failures recorded in footnotes. But every so often, there is a story that doesn't fail loudly or end violently. It simply stops. No final chapter, no conclusion, just absence. And among all the unanswered questions buried in the foundations of the United States, none is older or more unsettling than the disappearance of the Roanoke colony. This mystery does not begin with death or disaster. It begins with hope, with ambition, with the belief that a brand new world could be shaped by willpower alone. In the late 16th century, England stood on the edge of expansion, staring westward across the Atlantic Ocean at lands it barely understood but deeply desired. What followed would become a defining moment in colonial history, and a silence that has echoed for more than 400 years. In the late summer of 1590, an English ship approached Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. On board was Governor John White, returning after a long and desperate absence. He expected to reunite with a settlement of roughly 115 colonists, men, women, and children, who had been left behind years earlier. Among them were his own daughter and his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child ever born in the Americas. But as White and his crew came ashore, the island greeted them with stillness. No voices, no movement, no signs of daily life. The settlement was not destroyed. There were no burned buildings, no scattered weapons, no graves. The houses had been carefully dismantled, as if the inhabitants had packed up and left intentionally. It was an orderly absence, more disturbing than chaos. And then, carved into a wooden post, White found a single word: Croatoan. That word would become one of the most debated clues in American history. It offered a direction, but no explanation, a destination, but no story. And it marked the beginning of a mystery that has survived centuries of speculation, archaeology, and theory. To understand how an entire community could disappear without a trace, we have to step backward, past the silence, past the carving, past the abandoned settlement, and return to a time when Roanoke was not a warning, but a promise born from empire, rivalry, and the dangerous belief that the New World was waiting to be claimed. To understand why Roanoke existed at all, you have to step into the mindset of England in the late 16th century, a nation fueled by rivalry, fear, and ambition. This was an age when power was measured not only by armies, but by maps. Spain dominated the Atlantic world, enriched by gold from the Americas, and protected by a vast empire stretching across oceans. England, by contrast, was late to the game and painfully aware of it. Queen Elizabeth I ruled a country hungry for legitimacy on the global stage. Spain's success was not just an economic threat, but a political and religious one. England was Protestant, Spain was Catholic. Every new colony was not only a source of wealth, but a declaration of dominance. If England wanted to survive as a major power, it needed a foothold in the New World. That ambition found its champion in Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was the embodiment of Elizabethan confidence, an explorer, poet, soldier, and court favorite, with an eye always fixed on opportunity. He envisioned an English presence in North America that would serve multiple purposes: a base for privateers to disrupt Spanish shipping, a source of raw materials, and a symbol of England's expanding influence. He named this imagined land Virginia, in honor of the Virgin Queen herself. In 1584, Raleigh received a royal charter granting him the right to explore and establish settlements in lands not already claimed by a Christian monarch. It was a sweeping endorsement, but also a gamble. The crown would not fund the venture directly. Raleigh would have to finance the effort himself, risking his fortune and reputation on an unknown coastline thousands of miles away. That same year, Raleigh sent an exploratory expedition across the Atlantic. Its purpose was not settlement, but reconnaissance. The men were tasked with finding a suitable location, assessing local resources, and determining whether the land could support a permanent English presence. When they reached the Outer Banks, they encountered Roanoke Island, a narrow stretch of land protected by barrier islands and surrounded by shallow waters. The reports they brought back to England were overwhelmingly optimistic. They described fertile soil, abundant wildlife, and a mild climate. They spoke of native peoples who appeared curious rather than hostile. In an era desperate for good news, these accounts were embraced without hesitation. But those glowing descriptions masked a harsher reality. The Outer Banks were unstable, vulnerable to storms, and difficult to resupply. The political relationships between local tribes were complex and fragile. And England's understanding of the land was shallow at best. What Raleigh saw as a strategic paradise was, in truth, a dangerous testing ground. Still, buoyed by promise and driven by pressure, Raleigh moved forward. England would plant its flag in the New World, not cautiously, not gradually, but boldly. Next, realize that ambition becomes action, as England's first attempt at colonization turns Roanoke into a proving ground, and reveals just how unprepared they truly were. England's first real attempt to claim Roanoke was never meant to be a home. It was meant to be a foothold. In the spring of 1585, a fleet sponsored by Sir Walter Raleigh crossed the Atlantic, carrying just over 100 men. There were no families aboard, no children, no intention of permanence. These colonists were soldiers, sailors, and adventurers, sent to establish a strategic outpost that could support English expansion and harass Spanish shipping. The expedition was led by Sir Richard Grenville, a naval commander known for discipline and aggression. Once the ships reached the Outer Banks, Grenville returned to England to secure additional supplies, leaving the colony under the command of Ralph Lane. Lane was a hardened military officer, not a farmer or diplomat, and his approach would shape the colony's fate. From the moment they landed, misfortune followed. One of the main ships ran aground in shallow waters, damaging vital supplies. Food reserves were compromised almost immediately, and the settlers had little experience growing crops in unfamiliar soil. Survival quickly became dependent on nearby indigenous communities. At first, interactions with local groups were cautious but workable. The English relied heavily on food trade, particularly from the Croatoan people who lived nearby. But the relationship was fragile. The colonists demanded more than they offered, and misunderstandings grew into resentment. Lane, convinced that local leaders were plotting against him, responded not with negotiation but with force. In a decision that would permanently poison relations, Lane led an armed attack on a Croatoan village and killed their leader, Wingina. It was a preemptive strike, fueled by fear and arrogance, and it marked the beginning of the end. Trade stopped immediately. Food supplies vanished. The English were now isolated, hungry, and surrounded by hostile territory. As the winter of 1585 turned to desperation, disease and starvation began to take hold. The colony was no longer a symbol of imperial ambition. It was a liability. When Sir Francis Drake unexpectedly arrived in the region in the summer of 1586, returning from a Caribbean campaign, the settlers saw an escape. Drake offered them passage back to England. Faced with the choice between abandonment and annihilation, Lane and his men accepted. The first Roanoke colony was dismantled not by attack, but by failure. Failure to adapt, to cooperate, and to understand the land they hoped to claim. England's first colonial experiment in North America had collapsed within a year. But the story did not end there. Sir Walter Raleigh believed the lesson was not that colonization was impossible, but that it had been done wrong. And in that belief, he laid the groundwork for a second attempt, one built, not on soldiers, but on families. Sir Walter Raleigh refused to let Roanoke be remembered as a failure. Instead of retreating from the idea of colonization, he radically changed his approach. This time, the settlement would not be a military outpost. It would be a community. In the spring of 1587, a new expedition set sail under the leadership of John White, an artist and mapmaker who had previously visited Roanoke. Unlike the earlier group, these settlers were not hardened soldiers. They were craftsmen, laborers, and families, men and women prepared to build homes rather than forts. Among them were pregnant women and young children, a clear signal that this colony was intended to endure. The plan was not to return to Roanoke Island. The settlers were instructed to establish themselves farther north, near the Chesapeake Bay, where reports suggested better soil, deeper harbors, and safer access to supply routes. But plans at sea are fragile things. Navigation errors and interference from the ship's captain forced the group to land once again on Roanoke Island instead. Despite their reluctance, the colonists began rebuilding the abandoned settlement. They repaired structures left behind from the earlier colony and tried to re-establish contact with nearby indigenous groups. But the political landscape had changed. The violence carried out by the previous English settlers had not been forgotten. Many local tribes avoided the newcomers entirely. Others viewed them with suspicion or outright hostility. On Roanoke Island, life was harsh and uncertain. Food supplies were limited, and trade relationships were unstable. Yet even under these conditions, the colony pressed forward. Crops were planted, homes were repaired, and history quietly unfolded when a child was born to two of the settlers. Her name was Virginia Dare, born in August of 1587. She was the first known English child born in North America. To the settlers, her birth symbolized hope, a living proof that the colony could survive and grow. To Raleigh, she represented the future of England's claim to the continent. But hope could not replace supplies. The colonists soon realized that they could not survive without assistance from England. John White, torn between his duty as governor and his role as a grandfather to Virginia Dare, made the difficult decision to return home. He promised the settlers he would come back quickly with food, tools, and reinforcements. In late 1587, White sailed for England, leaving behind over 100 colonists on a vulnerable island, surrounded by uncertainty and dependent on a promise that crossed an ocean. He had no way of knowing that forces far beyond Roanoke would delay his return, and that the colony he left behind would vanish into history. John White expected to be gone for months. Instead, the Atlantic turned his promise into a cruel uncertainty. Shortly after his return to England, the nation was pulled into open conflict with Spain. The looming threat of invasion forced the Crown to redirect ships, crews, and supplies toward defense. Civilian voyages were delayed, then halted entirely. England's harbors filled with warships, not supply vessels. The Spanish Armada arrived in 1588, and England's attention turned fully to survival. For White, each passing month became a torment. He petitioned repeatedly for passage back to Roanoke, but every ship was either seized for war or deemed too valuable to risk across the Atlantic. By the time the immediate danger had passed, England's resources were exhausted. Years slipped by. It was not until 1590 that White finally secured a voyage back to the New World. The delay weighed heavily on him. The settlers he had left behind would have endured multiple winters with limited food, no reinforcements, and no assurance that help was ever coming. By the time his ship approached the Outer Banks, White was returning not as a governor, but as a man bracing for loss. They reached Roanoke Island in late summer. The landing party moved cautiously through familiar paths, calling out names that received no answer. What they found was not chaos, but silence. The settlement showed no signs of struggle. No burned buildings, no scattered belongings. Homes had been carefully dismantled, as if the inhabitants had planned their departure. Defensive structures had been taken down deliberately. The colony had not been destroyed. It had been emptied. Then White noticed something carved into a wooden post near the settlement. One word, cut cleanly into the timber. Croatoan. Nearby, on a tree, 3 letters were etched. C-R-O. Before leaving, White had instructed the settlers that if they were forced to abandon the colony, they should leave a sign of where they were going. If they left under duress, they were to mark a cross alongside the message. There was no cross. To White, this suggested intention rather than panic. The settlers had chosen to leave, but where Croatoan led, and whether it meant safety or something far darker, was still unknown. A storm rose suddenly along the coast, violent enough to damage the ships and threaten the crew. Against White's wishes, the captain refused to continue searching. With winter approaching and no safe harbor, they were forced to abandon the investigation. John White left the island once again, carrying only questions. He would never return. Next, we look at how the word carved into the wood becomes the centerpiece of speculation as historians and investigators attempt to follow the trail the colonists may have taken and uncover why they were never seen again. The word carved into the post was not a mystery in itself. Croatoan was a real place. It referred to Croatoan Island, known today as Hatteras Island, located south of Roanoke. The Croatoan people were a native group with whom the English had maintained comparatively friendly relations. Unlike other nearby tribes, they had not been involved in violent conflicts with the earlier colony. If the settlers were going anywhere willingly, Croatoan was the most logical destination. Yet logic did not bring answers. In the years that followed John White's final departure, no English expedition ever confirmed the colony's presence on Croatoan Island. Later explorers and settlers reported meeting indigenous people with lighter hair, gray eyes, or English words woven into their language. But these accounts were fragmented and inconsistent. None provided definitive proof that the Roanoke colonists had survived and integrated into local tribes. English records from the early 17th century deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. When Jamestown was established in 1607, colonists there actively searched for survivors from Roanoke. Captain John Smith recorded reports of Europeans living among native communities farther inland, but these claims were based on secondhand testimony, not direct encounters. One particularly unsettling account came from Powhatan, the powerful leader of a regional alliance of tribes. He claimed that some English settlers had been killed years earlier by his warriors, supposedly at the direction of local leaders who feared the further colonization. But Powhatan offered no physical evidence, no locations, and no surviving witnesses. His story raised as many doubts as it did explanations. Archaeology offered little clarity. Centuries of erosion, storms, and shifting shorelines altered the landscape beyond recognition. Any traces of wooden structures, temporary camps, or shallow graves would likely have been swallowed by time. Roanoke Island itself had changed shape since the 16th century, complicating efforts to reconstruct what truly happened. What remained was an absence that refused to resolve. There were no mass graves, no confirmed artifacts bearing names, no records of captives, no Spanish reports of attacks or rescues. For a disappearance involving over 100 people, the silence was absolute. As decades passed, Roanoke drifted from history into legend. Each generation inherited the same unanswered question. Did the settlers die together, or scatter and survive? Was Croatoan a destination, a warning, or a final hope carved into wood? By the time England firmly established itself in North America, Roanoke had already become a ghost story, an unresolved beginning haunting everything that followed. With no bodies, no documents, and no final witnesses, Roanoke became a canvas for speculation. Over the centuries, several dominant theories emerged, each attempting to impose order on the silence left behind. The most widely accepted explanation is assimilation. According to this theory, the colonists left Roanoke Island intentionally and were taken in by friendly native groups, most likely the Croatoan. Survival would have required adaptation, abandoning English customs, clothing, and language in exchange for protection and food. Over time, their identities would have faded into tribal life, leaving behind only faint traces in oral histories and genetic anomalies. Supporters point to later accounts of indigenous communities with European features and English-style technologies appearing far from the coast. Stone houses, iron tools, and agricultural practices unfamiliar to local tribes were reported by later settlers. None of this proves assimilation, but it suggests cultural blending may have occurred beyond the reach of English records. Another theory centers on forced displacement. The settlers may have been driven inland by hunger, drought, or tribal pressure, scattering in smaller groups rather than moving together. In this scenario, fragmentation was fatal. A divided colony would have struggled to survive long-term, making them vulnerable to conflict, disease, or gradual extinction without ever leaving a clear trail. More extreme interpretations suggest deliberate destruction. Spanish forces were active along the southeastern coastline, hostile to English expansion. A covert attack could explain the colony's disappearance, especially if survivors were captured or killed elsewhere. Yet Spanish records, typically meticulous in documenting victories over rivals, contain no mention of Roanoke. The absence of evidence weakens this explanation, but does not eliminate it. Environmental collapse offers another possibility. Tree ring data indicates severe drought conditions in the region during the late 16th century. Scarcity of food would have strained relationships with neighboring tribes and forced impossible choices. Leaving Roanoke may not have been a strategic decision, but an act of desperation. What makes Roanoke unique is not the number of theories, but the way each one explains part of the story while failing to explain all of it. No single answer accounts for the complete disappearance, the deliberate dismantling of the settlement, and the silence that followed. Roanoke resists resolution because it exists at the intersection of ambition and vulnerability, where history stopped recording and survival took over. As we wrap up, we step back from theories and ask a different question. Why Roanoke still matters, and what this disappearance reveals about the fragile beginnings of America itself. By the time English settlers successfully established Jamestown in the early 17th century, Roanoke was already fading into rumor. No rescue mission was ever launched. No official inquiry followed. The colony did not fail loudly. It simply slipped out of history's grip. And that quiet disappearance shaped everything that came next. Roanoke became a warning embedded in the American origin story. It taught future colonists that survival in the New World required cooperation, adaptability, and humility. Jamestown's early leaders carried that lesson with them, approaching native diplomacy and supply planning with caution born from Roanoke's absence. The Lost Colony did not leave behind buildings or records, but it left behind fear. And fear can be an effective teacher. What makes Roanoke endure is not just what happened, but what did not. There was no battlefield, no final letter, no mass grave to explain the end. The colonists made a choice, likely many choices, outside the reach of English power and documentation. In doing so, they stepped beyond the narrative their homeland expected them to fulfill. Modern archaeology continues to chase fragments rather than conclusions. Each artifact recovered, each indigenous oral history revisited, reshapes the question instead of answering it. Roanoke has shifted from a mystery of disappearance into a mystery of transformation. The people did not simply vanish. They changed in ways the historical record could not capture. That may be the most unsettling truth of all. The Lost Colony challenges the idea that history only belongs to those who write it. It reminds us that entire communities can survive, adapt, and disappear from official memory without ever truly being gone. In the end, Roanoke's legacy is not carved into wood or stone, but into uncertainty. A single word left behind did not ask to be decoded, it asked to be believed. And 400 years later, that silence still echoes, daring us to listen. 3.